On Christmas Eve of 2002, a young woman, 8 months pregnant, vanished without a trace. Her name was Laci Peterson, and her disappearance gripped the nation. Months later, what was pulled from the waters of the San Francisco Bay would horrify America and leave an unshakable scar on her family. This is not fiction. This is a true story of love, betrayal, and a tragedy that still chills us to this day. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below so that stories like this are never forgotten. Laci's world before the disappearance. In late 2002, Laci Peterson was a picture of warmth, hope, and anticipation. At just 27 years old, she was 8 months pregnant with her first child, a baby boy she and her husband had already named Connor. The couple lived in Modesto, California, a city surrounded by orchards and farmland, where suburban streets were lined with tidy homes and neighbors who exchanged friendly waves. Laci was described by friends and family as full of life, with a radiant smile and a contagious laugh. She had always dreamed of being a mother, and as Christmas approached, she was preparing not only for the holiday, but for the arrival of her son. Her home was decorated, gifts were wrapped, and she spoke excitedly about her future. To those who knew her best, she was glowing with joy. Her husband, Scott Peterson, was 30 years old and, to outsiders, seemed like the ideal partner, handsome, charming, and polite. Scott was the kind of man who made a good first impression. He worked as a fertilizer salesman, while Laci, having studied ornamental horticulture, embraced creating a warm and beautiful home. Together, they looked like the perfect couple, young, attractive, and ready to start a family. But as history would later reveal, the surface was not the whole story. On the morning of December 24th, 2002, Laci disappeared. Scott told police that he had left home that morning to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina, about 90 miles away. Laci, according to him, had planned to walk their dog in the neighborhood park. When Scott returned that evening, the dog was found wandering the street, leash still attached, but there was no sign of Laci. Her sudden disappearance set off immediate alarm bells. Family members insisted that Laci would never leave voluntarily, especially not with the holiday so close and her due date only weeks away. Police quickly classified her as a missing person under suspicious circumstances. As news spread, Modesto transformed overnight. Volunteers organized massive search efforts. Hundreds of community members walked fields, canals, and neighborhoods, calling out Laci's name. Flyers with her picture were plastered across stores, gas stations, and utility poles. Media vans descended on the city, broadcasting updates that would soon grip the entire country. Laci's family, particularly her mother, Sharon Rocha, became the emotional heart of the case. With a trembling voice, Sharon pleaded on television for her daughter's safe return. She begged the public for help, reminding viewers that Laci was not only a missing young woman, but a mother-to-be who carried a baby boy, due to arrive in February. Sharon's grief was raw, and it resonated with millions of Americans watching at home. Meanwhile, police began to take a closer look at Scott Peterson. At first, he appeared supportive, standing beside Laci's family during press conferences. But detectives noticed something odd. His demeanor seemed calm, even detached. Where Laci's family was frantic and emotional, Scott appeared composed, rehearsed, and sometimes even cold. For investigators, this was an early red flag. The search for Laci Peterson quickly grew into one of the most publicized missing persons cases in American history. Every detail of her life, her marriage, and her last known movements were dissected by both police and the media. Strangers from across the country wrote letters of support, sent donations, and joined online forums to share theories. But as weeks turned into months, the trail grew colder. Despite exhaustive searches of fields, waterways, and rural roads, no sign of Laci or baby Connor was found. Each passing day deepened the sense of dread. What had happened to this young mother and her unborn child? Unbeknownst to many, the truth was lurking just below the surface, and it would come crashing to light in the most horrifying way imaginable. The investigation and suspicion on Scott Peterson. As the days turned into weeks following Laci Peterson's disappearance, Modesto became a city under siege by both grief and media attention. Every street seemed to carry her face, printed on posters and flyers that pleaded for her safe return. Volunteers scoured the countryside, searching orchards, canals, and empty fields. Boats dragged through waterways and helicopters circled overhead, but despite the enormous effort, there was still no sign of Laci, no trace of her unborn son, Connor. For investigators, the absence of physical evidence was troubling. In most missing person cases, there are clues, a trace of clothing, a footprint, a witness sighting. But here, there was nothing. The only lead came from the man who had been with her last, her husband, Scott Peterson, and from the beginning. Scott's behavior gave detectives reason to look closer. At first, Scott did what many would expect of a worried husband. He stood beside Laci's family at press conferences, handed out flyers, and gave interviews to television stations. But his demeanor was unsettling. While Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, trembled with emotion, Scott appeared calm, almost detached. His words lacked urgency. His eyes lacked tears. For some, this composure seemed like strength. For investigators, it looked like indifference. Detectives began to examine Scott's story more closely. He claimed that on the morning of December 24th, he had gone fishing at the Berkeley Marina, a location nearly 90 miles away. It struck police as an unusual decision. It was Christmas Eve. His wife was 8 months pregnant, and family gatherings were scheduled for later that day. Why would a man choose to spend the morning alone on a fishing trip? Further doubts emerged when detectives traced Scott's movements. His alibi placed him at the marina, but there were no other witnesses to confirm his presence on the water. While his boat was indeed found at the dock, the timing and details left investigators uneasy. As the investigation pressed on, whispers began to circulate. Rumors of marital problems surfaced. Friends of the couple described their relationship as strained in recent months. And then came the revelation that would turn suspicion into outright scrutiny. Scott Peterson was having an affair. The woman's name was Amber Frey, a massage therapist living in Fresno, California. According to Amber, Scott had told her he was single. In fact, he had gone so far as to claim that he had lost his wife, that she had died long before Laci was ever reported missing. Amber was shocked to learn that Scott's wife was not only alive, but missing and plastered across every news channel in America. When Amber realized the truth, she made a decision that would prove pivotal in the case. She contacted the police. From that moment on, she began cooperating with investigators, even recording phone calls with Scott to provide evidence. These recordings were damning. In them, Scott maintained the image of a grieving husband in public while speaking to Amber privately as though nothing were wrong. On New Year's Eve, while a candlelight vigil was being held for Laci, Scott phoned Amber and told her he was in Paris, watching fireworks. In reality, he was in Modesto, standing among the crowd, pretending to mourn his missing wife. For investigators, these contradictions were impossible to ignore. While the public was still clinging to hope that Laci might be found alive, police were growing more certain that this was no disappearance. It was a homicide, and the prime suspect was her husband. But even with Amber's cooperation, detectives still faced a challenge. There was no body, no physical evidence tying Scott to foul play. Without a crime scene, without proof of violence, suspicion alone would not be enough for a conviction. Still, the weight of Scott's behavior grew heavier by the day. He seemed more concerned with avoiding reporters than finding his wife. He dodged questions, grew evasive, and at times even combative with those around him. To Laci's family, his distance was agonizing. They had once welcomed him as a son-in-law, but now, many began to see him as a stranger. Meanwhile, the media frenzy reached a fever pitch. News vans lined the streets outside the Peterson home. Journalists dissected every detail of Scott's life, every rumor, every whisper of scandal. Talk shows debated his guilt or innocence. America was captivated, horrified, and divided. Behind the cameras, detectives kept pressing forward. They believed Scott Peterson had killed his wife and unborn child, but until bodies were found, their case remained fragile. And then, in April of 2003, nearly 4 months after Laci disappeared, the San Francisco Bay gave up its terrible secret. The discovery at San Francisco Bay. It was mid-April 2003. Nearly 4 months had passed since Laci Peterson had vanished from her Modesto home. The search had grown weary. The public's hope had dimmed, and investigators were caught in a torturous limbo. They were certain she was dead, but they had no proof. Without a body, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. Then, on April 13th, 2003, a couple walking along the rocky shoreline of the San Francisco Bay near Richmond stumbled upon something horrifying. Tangled in the marsh reeds, partially submerged, was the body of a small infant. The remains were decomposed, but unmistakably those of a late-term fetus. Investigators would later confirm it was Connor, the unborn son of Laci Peterson. The following day, April 14th, the bay revealed yet another grim discovery. Less than a mile away, a second body surfaced. This time, it was the remains of an adult female. The body was badly decomposed, missing its head, both arms, and most of its legs. Yet the torso was still clothed in maternity pants, the same kind Laci Peterson had been wearing on the morning she vanished. Though the body was unrecognizable, the condition of the remains told investigators everything they feared. This was Laci Peterson. The horror of the discovery sent shockwaves across the nation. The condition of the bodies was graphic and deeply disturbing. Forensic pathologists determined that the fetus had been expelled from Laci's decaying body, likely due to natural processes of decomposition. Yet the image, a mother and child both lost, found separately but within reach of one another, seared itself into America's collective memory. The location of the remains was no coincidence. Months earlier, when Scott Peterson told detectives he had gone fishing on Christmas Eve, he said he had launched his boat at the Berkeley Marina, which sat directly across the bay from where the bodies were discovered. Investigators had suspected this area from the beginning, even dragging parts of the bay in earlier searches. Now, the water itself had provided confirmation. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Television networks interrupted programming with breaking news. Crowds gathered near the shoreline as investigators cordoned off the scene. Reporters broadcast live, their voices hushed as they described the grisly details. The nation, already captivated by the case, was horrified by the tragic end. For Laci's family, the discovery was shattering. For months, they had clung to the fragile hope that she might still be alive, perhaps held somewhere against her will. That hope was extinguished the moment the bodies were confirmed. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, later recalled the devastation as beyond words. Not only had she lost her daughter, but her grandson as well. 2 generations gone in an instant. For investigators, the discovery was the break they needed. They now had physical evidence tying the case back to Scott. The fact that the remains surfaced so close to his fishing alibi was more than coincidence. It painted a chilling picture that Scott had driven to the marina on Christmas Eve, not for a fishing trip, but to dispose of his wife's body and unborn son in the cold waters of the bay. The autopsies provided limited but telling details. Because of the level of decomposition, medical examiners could not determine an exact cause of death. There were no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, nothing conclusive. But the condition of the remains, combined with the suspicious circumstances, left little doubt in the minds of investigators. Laci had not left willingly. She had been killed, and her body dumped. The gruesome reality of the case dominated headlines. Talk shows, newspapers, and nightly news broadcasts dissected every detail. Images of searchers standing along the shoreline, investigators carrying away evidence bags, and boats patrolling the bay became etched into the public consciousness. America was united in its grief and in its outrage. Public suspicion, already high, now turned almost unanimously against Scott Peterson. His calm demeanor, his affair with Amber Frey, his inconsistencies, all of it now seemed to point to guilt. To many, the bodies in the bay confirmed what they had long suspected. Scott had murdered his pregnant wife and unborn child. Investigators wasted no time. Within days of the discovery, they moved to make an arrest. Scott Peterson, once the handsome husband standing alongside his grieving in-laws, was now the prime suspect in a double murder case that would soon grip the world. But Scott wasn't waiting to face justice quietly. When police closed in, he was found near the Mexican border with cash, multiple cell phones, his brother's ID, and his hair dyed blonde. To detectives, it looked like an attempted escape. To the public, it looked like confirmation of guilt. The discovery of the bodies had turned suspicion into certainty, and now, America was preparing for a trial that would become one of the most watched court cases of the early 21st century. The trial of Scott Peterson. When the bodies of Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor were recovered from the San Francisco Bay in April 2003, investigators wasted no time. Just 4 days later, on April 18th, police arrested Scott Peterson near San Diego. The circumstances of his arrest fueled public outrage and media frenzy. Scott was found carrying $15,000 in cash, 4 cell phones, survival gear, camping equipment, and his brother's driver's license. His hair and beard had been dyed blonde, and his Mercedes was packed with supplies. To police, it looked like a man preparing to run. To the public, it looked like proof. The charges were devastating. First-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of baby Connor. The case immediately became one of the most high-profile trials of the decade. News networks devoted hours of coverage. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, and millions of Americans followed every detail. When the trial began in 2004, prosecutors painted a picture of a man who was charming on the outside, but selfish and manipulative underneath. They argued that Scott Peterson killed his wife because he wanted freedom. Freedom from marriage, freedom from fatherhood, and freedom to pursue other relationships. To them, Laci's pregnancy, once a sign of joy, had become, in Scott's eyes, a burden. The prosecution's key witness was Amber Frey, Scott's mistress. Amber testified that Scott had told her he was single, and later, that he had confessed his wife had died before she actually disappeared. Jurors heard recordings of Scott calling Amber from jail and from his home, spinning lies and showing little concern for his missing wife. To the jury, those calls revealed not only betrayal, but motive. Scott wanted a new life without the responsibilities of family. The prosecution also emphasized the location of the bodies. Scott admitted he had gone fishing on Christmas Eve at the Berkeley Marina. Months later, Laci and Connor's remains were found less than 2 miles from where he said he had been. The circumstantial evidence, they argued, was overwhelming. But the defense fought back. Scott's attorney, Mark Geragos, argued that the case against his client was built on suspicion, not proof. There was no murder weapon, no crime scene, and no direct physical evidence linking Scott to the deaths. Geragos suggested that Laci had been abducted by strangers, perhaps while walking the dog, and that her body had been dumped in the bay by someone else. The defense also criticized the police investigation, claiming it was biased from the beginning. Once detectives learned of Scott's affair with Amber Frey, they locked in on him as the suspect and ignored other possible leads. Geragos told jurors that Scott's lies about the affair were shameful, but adultery was not murder. Despite the defense's efforts, the trial became a showcase of Scott's behavior, his calmness, his dishonesty, and his apparent lack of grief. Jurors watched video clips of Scott at vigils, standing silently while pretending to mourn, even as he secretly called his mistress. They saw photographs of him smiling on vacation, taken while his wife was still missing. To many, it was damning. The courtroom atmosphere was electric. Spectators lined up before dawn to secure a seat. News anchors dissected testimony each night, and America seemed to divide into 2 camps, those convinced of Scott's guilt and those who doubted the evidence. After months of testimony, closing arguments delivered the final blow. The prosecution told jurors that Scott Peterson had planned the murder, disposed of his wife in the bay, and then lied to cover his tracks. The defense countered that there was no solid proof, only suspicion magnified by media hysteria. On November 12, 2004, after nearly 6 months of testimony and 7 days of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder for Laci and second-degree murder for Connor. The courtroom erupted with gasps and tears. Laci's family wept openly, clutching one another in relief and sorrow. Sharon Rocha later said it was not justice that brought peace, but at least accountability. But the trial was not over. The sentencing phase came next, and prosecutors sought the death penalty. In December, the jury recommended execution. On March 16, 2005, Scott Peterson was formally sentenced to death and sent to California's notorious San Quentin State Prison. For many Americans, the trial symbolized both justice and tragedy. Justice, because a man believed to have betrayed and murdered his wife and unborn child was held accountable. Tragedy, because no verdict could bring Laci and Connor back. The case also revealed deep cracks in how the media covers true crime. The Peterson trial was broadcast like a spectacle, with pundits turning human tragedy into nightly entertainment. Critics argued that the relentless coverage risked influencing the jury and turning justice into theatre. Yet for millions, it was impossible to look away. By the end of the trial, Scott Peterson was a household name, not as the charming young husband he once appeared to be, but as the convicted murderer of his pregnant wife and unborn child. Still, the story of Laci Peterson was not finished. Appeals, controversies, and questions would continue to swirl long after the verdict. Aftermath, appeals, and legacy of the case. When the trial ended and Scott Peterson was sentenced to death in 2005, many believed the story was finally over. For Laci's family, the verdict brought a measure of accountability, but no true peace. Sharon Rocha, Laci's mother, spoke often about the emptiness that never left her, the empty chair at family dinners, the unborn grandson she would never hold, the Christmas mornings forever stained by loss. Scott was sent to San Quentin State Prison, housed on death row with some of California's most infamous inmates. For years, he remained largely out of sight, but not out of mind. The Peterson case continued to loom large in America's memory, referenced in documentaries, books, and nightly news retrospectives. But the legal battle was far from finished. Scott's defense team immediately filed appeals, arguing that media saturation, juror misconduct, and judicial errors had tainted the trial. They claimed that Scott had been convicted more by public opinion than by hard evidence. And in some ways, they were not wrong. The Peterson case had become a spectacle unlike almost any other, with cable news and tabloids treating it as a nightly drama. In 2020, after nearly 2 decades of appeals, the California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, ruling that the jury selection process had been flawed. Jurors who opposed the death penalty had been dismissed improperly, creating what the court described as a biased sentencing. However, the murder convictions themselves were upheld, meaning Scott would remain guilty of killing Laci and Connor, but would face life imprisonment rather than execution. That decision reignited debate. Supporters of the Peterson family were frustrated, feeling that justice had been diluted. Others argued that the original trial had been too influenced by the media circus to be truly fair. Regardless of opinion, one fact remained unshakable: Scott Peterson would never walk free. The aftermath of the case also left a lasting cultural imprint. For many Americans, Laci's story was not just about one woman's tragic death. It became a cautionary tale about trust, betrayal, and the hidden darkness that can live behind a perfect facade. The image of Laci, glowing with pregnancy in family photographs, contrasted painfully with the reality of her fate. That contrast still haunts those who followed the case. The case also reshaped conversations about victims' rights and laws protecting unborn children. In 2004, partly in response to Laci's death, the U.S. Congress passed the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, also known as Laci and Connor's Law. This legislation recognized unborn children as separate victims when they are injured or killed during the commission of federal crimes. For Laci's family, it was a way to honor both mother and son, to ensure their loss was not forgotten in the eyes of the law. Sharon Rocha emerged as a powerful voice for victims of crime. Through her grief, she advocated for other families, shared her story publicly, and wrote about the enduring pain of losing a child to violence. Her strength became an inspiration to many who had suffered similar tragedies. As for Scott Peterson, he remains one of the most infamous convicted killers in American history, even decades later. His name sparks debate. Some continue to argue that the evidence against him was circumstantial, pointing to the lack of a clear murder weapon or crime scene. Others believe the circumstantial evidence, combined with his lies, affair, and behavior, painted a damning portrait of guilt. Documentaries, podcasts, and television specials have continued to revisit the case, each re-examining the same haunting question. Was Scott Peterson wrongfully convicted, or was he truly the husband who betrayed and murdered his wife and unborn son? For many Americans, the answer is clear. For others, doubt lingers. Yet for those who loved Laci, the legacy of the case is not about Scott at all. It is about remembering who she was, a vibrant young woman, full of life and joy, preparing to become a mother. It is about the child she carried, a baby boy named Connor, whose life ended before it began. And it is about the family left behind, forced to carry grief that no court ruling, no verdict, and no law could ever erase. 2 decades later, the story of Laci Peterson still resonates. It is a reminder of how fragile trust can be, how quickly lives can be shattered, and how important it is to keep telling the stories of victims, so they are never reduced to headlines alone. And as we close this chapter, let us not forget, this was not fiction, not television drama, but a true story, one that continues to haunt the conscience of America. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Together, we keep their memory alive.